Welcome to Moments with Marianne. This is your host, Marianne Pastana. And we're here today with special guest, Khentrul Lodrö T'hayé Rinpoche, who's here to share with us his new book, The Power of the Mind, a Tibetan monk's guide to finding freedom in every challenge. Also here today with us is Paloma Lopez Landry, who's here to translate Rinpoche's words from Tibetan to English for us. So Rinpoche is a Tibetan monk and the director of Katag, which is a nonprofit organization based in the U.S. He oversees more than 20 practice groups across North America and in China, Australia, and South Africa, as well as a retreat center in Northwest Arkansas. And he's one of the very few people in the world to hold 3 degrees, which are the equivalent of 3 PhDs in Buddhist philosophy. So welcome to the show, Rinpoche.
Thank you so much for having me here. I'm very happy to have this opportunity to speak with you.
Well, thank you. It's such an honor to have you here to talk about your new book. What was the inspiration for this book?
Teni tapshetan nga lam chonna mutse kan lo chongchong imbi ni kam ni kyang lo jong ze de tang tang bo ni ngo zu ni yong yin. Teni America la leb ni malo ni hen ro song ti wa de ni hui che tam che kana ni zo zo de ni sha ya de ka re se na lo jong ko de zo yin. Jamba Mangbo she yore te yin zo de lo jong gimsan kan re se na ti go ni pe pan tok chenbo chi yo pa de rong ke nyam nyong ko to ni chup song.
So, in general, this is a teaching on working with the mind that we call Lojong, which I have been training in since a very young age. And so it's been one of my kind of closest sort of heart practices. And then I came to the United States almost 20 years ago. And during this time, one of the principal teachings that I gave as I traveled and taught was mind training. And I have found that it is one of the most powerful and effective teachings that anyone can take up and use to benefit their lives.
So why is it important for us to tame our minds?
Tere teni ta ten gimsan kare re se na ne nga cho shirtang ko mze ati sim ta nam tok te halipi ta gupo nam jin ko durjung cha ni shin mam nyong kan ka sim nga chu sim de tedi chi yo re ti tang la teni tang sang tu ngam ba ning ma ngap do bi tu chu se na da ha chang ko te ti nang la nyong bi ning ma ke tu chot ngam ba chi la le bi yo re ti gim san ki nga chu sem nang la tes sem durjung she pi tablam chi men ni zong te ka ngar tang dungar mang che wa te sem khorang ko zo khyo re ti sher na sem gi dungar sem ko ser gu khyo na ne ngi par tan dar ta lo jong ka tablam chi la ma ten na tab jam ba chi ku kang ge yin na yang ndur to khyo mar gem san te res.
So, the importance of mind training is because when we just let our mind kind of be in its sort of natural or wild state, then we are completely overrun by all of our thoughts and emotions and mental states like a wild horse. And we have no ability to work with our mind and circumstances in ways that are effective and beneficial. And so on the one hand, then there's the need to learn to work with our mind to change our experiences. And on the other, then we also find ourselves in a time period where there is a lot of kind of degeneration in behavior, in outer circumstances, but particularly in our mind, what we call in Buddhist philosophy, they say that a time of the 5 degenerations, of which one of them specifically is of our disturbing emotions, a time where we have much more amplified greater disturbing emotions, and then, subsequent harmful and negative behaviors. And so when we look at changing our experience, then the principal factor that determines it is our mind, not the conditions or circumstances that we find ourselves in. And that's why it's indispensable that we learn how to work with our mind, what we call taming the mind or transforming the mind training, because the majority of why and how we suffer over the hardships and challenges that we face is actually the mind, is our mental suffering over those circumstances. And the only thing that can truly and completely dispel the suffering of mind is mind. Mind frees itself from its own suffering. And that's what mind training methods are about, the mind learning to free itself from its own mental suffering and affliction. And no external circumstance or other condition has the power to do that.
When we talk about our mind and our perception, is it really kind of shifting how we look at things?
Lojong Shetu wants to some more tatang Georgiore or Chitang Kande Chiktam to Tessa.
Teni ngatsu nyamyong dinget do hyoro Gimson gari rezena shirta ngatsu sina dewan dongkan da dungar mandong kayin ba tamchit chikpari semchinchi yin sarnib zote chorna de yore deep shirna lojong de rang sosu shit tabna de la tenni semnang ge kyun mang po chik cha nam tok ngamba mang po chik cha de metro watang yin ro watang gir no wa chik chapa mazat lojong ko taptela tenni rang ka sem kana ka yonten mang po chik lep yong khyo patang sar to ke yong khyo patang otri yong khyo re de ta wu yonten ke yong wi kabla sem kinala jibde chimbo chik top khyo re tendi phi ni devi chorna te medni mano devi chorna te shung watang dev jinto dungar ka chorna tamchit metro ya de otri knyam no chaparwa chi yong khyo res jambi ken kangla tu na shiror ken ka top ki ndarta wo chi yong top khyo mares.
So, yes, when we change our perception or when we change the way in which we relate to any given circumstance or experience, then our experience is changed, is fundamentally transformed. And the entire basis of looking at our mind and how it affects our experience is the fact that all of us, no matter who we are as a living being, we want to experience well-being. You can call that happiness or joy or pleasure, but the full spectrum of well-being. And none of us wants to experience any kind of pain, any kind of physical or mental suffering or discomfort. And essentially all sentient beings then have this same wish. We want to have pleasant or positive sensations, and we don't want unpleasant or painful sensations. And so that is the purpose of mind training, is recognizing that each of us has this wish for well-being and to not suffer, and then seeing how the primary role that determines this in any given circumstances is our mind. And that when we work with our mind, then what we are doing is we are kind of changing our experience from the inside out in decreasing the negative thoughts and emotions and flaws of our mind. And as those ways of relating to things through negative thoughts and emotions, essentially perceptions, decrease, then our well-being, our peace, and our way of responding and such increases. And so mind training is a process of decreasing our negative thoughts and emotions that we react with and increasing our positive qualities so that we have different positive ways of thinking about and relating and perceiving things. And those positive qualities, when our mind is those qualities, then it experiences greater peace and well-being naturally. And then naturally we suffer over things less. And so the mind training is this of, decreasing our suffering, increasing our well-being through that process of changing our thoughts and ways of relating to things. And that is something that changing our external circumstances can never bring for us. Nothing out there in the world has the power to affect us so much as our own mind.
It seems that we're constantly being tossed around the waves of either happy or sad emotions. Something happened, I'm happy. Something really bad happened, now I'm sad. So how do we get to this place of balance with our emotions?
다때더니 싫던 겐감바 벤디망보 지금 계란 글라베 나오신 당상 탐칠라 무스던 서인나 계속도 할리바가 축차도 보침보 지금 강라요레 데이터 때니 뭐마보 지금 셈축요레 피로를 금종신 축 난거 셈축 데라 때니 잠볼랑 락막축당 나차당 데니 좀때 environment injecting kamko korip tamchilla torlak rokyo patang tamchilla nyodama boji shongjimbi kapre yenayang tani ngatu semde gandipshini tikni kaptela dapo japko gndo sena tan dini kapla ngatu dapo ji jap mathapna halipi kangar tang nyoda chembo chikna yangni yang to songroya ma tokoma 유스킨 탐치 그 지순당이 송나 나조 데일리 타리아치 메반다오치 체크요레 데인나 나츠 피르당 데 로브종 코랑가나 그 차추 쪼데 가르레 제나 로브종 지파티 깽을 남키르제데 코랑 차추 쪼 레베오레 디브신나 깽을 남키르시 비고니 나츠데 람키르시 구요레 깽을 남키르라 Koran Lankir Shekang the Tablam Mandawa Maboyores.
Deep Dangland Jambatesa, DJ Jambatesa Shena, Mo Kaniti like Tanda Nizon, De Bartu Lebtuba, so D go to them. So the first part is just acknowledging like exactly what you said about where we find ourselves right now. An ocean of negativity is a good example of just like the intensity of what's taking place in society and on the earth, where there's all of this external turbulence and then there's this internal turbulence. And so we have, we're in a time where there's a lot of destruction of the environment and natural disasters that are occurring due to its healthy decline. And then likewise, internally, our minds are disturbed. And then we have, on top of that's compounded by pandemics and sickness. And so we find ourselves just with this internal agitation, external agitation. And more than ever, we need to learn how to have kind of ownership of our own mind so that it's not completely controlled by and just consumed by the circumstances. And that is something that everybody needs to begin to develop a skill in, is owning their own mind and their own mental afflictions and negative thoughts and so forth. Because if we don't do that and we solely rely on those external circumstances and just constantly, endlessly kind of chase after them, then there's no kind of way to solve our issues. And so much of what is taking place has to begin within ourselves. And especially mind training is a technique. The Lodrö teachings are especially powerful for our present day and age because they have very special teachings that focus on how to carry adversity into the path, meaning to transform our adverse circumstances into something positive. And it has a lot of unique methods therein.
Teni ta Lodrö T'hayé Tela Rinpoche Mandawa Kahi Yore. Teni Tambo Dengi Gimber Gari Zekio Zena Lodrö Dansanga so Hajang Garchimbo Telana Musin Ganga Muriksi Nanda Jakab Sujikumayanda Kitsokangana Yonayanda Teni tansang mamampo ta mergawa mampo chi kundu hite yang ni yang to gomkhi yore. Kitsok la mergawa tang, devjin to mala mergawa tang, devjin to nzamu lang la shirtang ka kare shini rokho yo pa tetso la tsawa ni mergawa. Teni mampo chi ku hating yin chi ka to la hate zete hachang ka mampo chi lep yore. Tela yo lep ni kansam chi la tsawa ni sem ka no dekit me pa sem la dekit me na lu de la yo dekit chi toku yo mare deep shit na na teni te heading map shit se te mi gimbar ke te ze kyo te la nga gimsen chembo chi yo re gimsen kare re ze na na ngupu chuni la na chetsam ki mergawin doshi te kom na na te tsam ki dungar semnang ke dungar cher ro fyo pa ngupu chuni la cha khyo re.
So, in terms of how we get to a place, as you mentioned, get from here to a place where even amidst this turmoil, we have some kind of well-being of mind, and begin to shift our experience from inside to the outside external world. Rinpoche said the mind training has many different methods, and typically then there's like the first place that we begin is a willingness to change our mind about how we experience things. And this is no matter who we are, no matter what our circumstances are, no matter what country we live in, no matter what culture we're indoctrinated in, wherever we are and under all circumstances, then that has to begin with addressing the perception that so many of us have on a constant basis of things that we dislike, meaning the dislike for things. We have a habit, a habituation for disliking things. Basically, kind of the English sort of colloquialism would be like hating on things. Whether we dislike something about someone or whether we dislike something that's taking place in the world, we are constantly perceiving things and thinking, I don't like this, I don't like that. We're hating on things. And the problem with that is that whenever we dislike or hate on something, is then there is absolutely no opportunity for well-being in that moment. And so the more that we dislike, the more we suffer over things. And it causes our mind to have unhappiness. And eventually that affects our physical well-being as well. And so the first kind of initial step in mind training is a willingness to stop hating. And this is based on logic about the way things operate, which is that as much as we have the perception of dislike is as much as we suffer. This is the way things are. And so it begins in our mind.
Teni da wo chakhiore. Teni te korang sem korang ke nortang te teni re. Kwena kare ze nangi long chi kyong ke yin. Sem ki nordok mashina chipshi sem la detumet nordok shipping kipala kengen trokso charo.
So this is the operating system of our mind. It's the basic kind of principle of how we experience things. So Rinpoche said there's a scriptural quote that I'd like to share with you. And this is it. If we do not know the operating system of our mind, no matter what we do, there will be no opportunity for happiness. But for one who is wise in the operating system of their mind, for them, even adverse conditions can arise as a friend.
I really love that. Thank you for sharing that. I think because a lot of people, when we look at adversity, a lot of times it could be difficult to get into this mindset that this is something that is happening with us for our best good as opposed to us.
Yes, for sure.
So, teni da wo re teni re teni Tate ngatu kansam chigla shirtong ke kin ngamba yin damen ke chapar medni mzeti semzeti chatsamala murgawi ndukhi komni rogoyo pate ngatu hako yore pena ngatu murgawi kansak chigla kyo yang yang duk pena kansak ti kachap shatang yin na nda kansak ti lika yin na yang nda te murgawa na chigla na yin rang warta na tertar to komni sona na yin rang warta tertar to komni sona na kare chak lok yore zena na kansam chigla duk mata pachik kan na watang kan that patang cha chama dar thong yo wanda wo chi sem ku zo yo yore the yur korang ke kyun mare zo wo ma te kare zena rang ke sem ku kumchur ko wang ke de shong ku yore di shen na ngi gembar de heading map shit se kyo yim chang kang re ze zena na chitsam ko murgawi ndukhi komna zere changla not pa mang ze long chi yore te nam jin phini ta nga chu lo yore 입시나 샘 코랑 그땅니 노르땅 약보지 하고 소나 가서 운이 강가땅 동거 끝나라 마포송 구이 점선 요 말에 연칙문이 당상 마탐체 급삼로 땅 남신 그 요다 마포 땅나 동거 마포 땅 뉴몽 바 마포 땅 샘처 마포 땅 이묵 그나차 depression 대소 할리바 마포지 구이 점선 요 말나라 소수 샘그 노르땅 약보지 희니 탑람들 무부춘이 땅 탐바 지니 소낭 이퍼트 판토 쳔보지 땅은 리우 쳔보지 땅 집대 토팔라리와 요리
So Rinpoche said, yes, Marianne, exactly as you said. Then that's kind of the basis of beginning to understand how we have to learn about our mind, because in reality, whether we experience adverse conditions as being bad or something that is good is not the condition itself, but it's actually our mind. And then on top of that, if we build this habit for constantly disliking things, it's like we build the habit for the perception of dislike. And whatever we're habituated to then becomes our reality. And so then we start to dislike one thing and another thing. And pretty soon, then our dislike and discontent grows. It's kind of like if you focus on something you dislike about an individual, then every day you think about it and you dwell on it, then it becomes bigger and bigger. And then you have more and more of this level of animosity, and at a certain point you can't kind of overcome it because it's just become so big in your mind due to its focus. And so then anything in the world can become the greatest suffering we've ever experienced, just dependent upon how much our mind focuses on how much it dislikes it. And then not only do we build the habit with that one thing, but then because we build the habit to perceive in terms of dislike, then we eventually start seeing everything as we're finding what we dislike in everything, seeing the flaws of everything. And eventually everything is our enemy. Everything is always adversarial and not okay with us. And we simply hate on everything. So that's like the first step of recognizing. Then we have to acknowledge that the dislike itself is one of the primary causes of suffering. And as the texts say, the more sensitive we are, the more vulnerable to harm we are, which is to say that the more that we dislike things, the more likely we're going to dislike and experience being harmed by things. And so that is the first kind of basis of recognizing that much of our hardship and our suffering then is because of our habituation to dislike. And then how much we suffer over things is also proportionate to how much we dislike them. And we're kind of perpetuating the turmoil in the world by continuing to hate on the suffering, to hate on the circumstances, to hate on the things, to worry about it, to have anxiety about it, depression, anxiousness, and so forth, loneliness. All of these things come about, and we're just kind of exasperating them by not really understanding how our mind works and then perpetuating these habits. And so the first step is recognizing the role that our perception plays in our experience and habituation, and wanting to make a change, being willing to give up hating on suffering.
당이 뒤출라 카키 제니 데니 디질라 캐랑타와티나리 데 나츠 gem생 그 독니 데스타도 무부 추닐라 릭비 딱상 샤팝시 바당 라나서수 냠뇽라 데나양 하고기오레 너타우 니타달 라마 탁바 남진테 데스타우 지 체크요 바레 디브시나 오나타 테니 나츠 tampote 머가윈도 히체점 곰나 대점기 둥거 체를 놓고요 바데 하고니 tampote ngo히고아테 같이 모레스 데니 니파테 카레레제나 오나타 ngo히나 땅아초 카레고 훈두제나 나츠 셈들라 누스톱 지고고요레 셈 코랑라 코랑 누스톱 쫀고요 데 카레 고요레제나네 데니 머가윈도 히곰나 구파 Tawani ni me patang, guba me pa mazat, mergawin dukhir chik yot nayang, tela teni, semnang ke dungar ma po chik tang, nyumo pa ma po chik, dungar jamba ma po chik, tis tang la, numba gyab ni, lev khiyore, nyumo pa ma po chik, tis tang la, tela teni, yongwe yore, natsu semnang la, yang ni yang tu yongwe yore, tis kyon ma po chikim yong ni, 차기오레스 디gemsangi te tawo hakobi toni ta kare gogundo zenane ronk semna nustup zoktan de kare zenane ken ngamba kang shongyona ngi khirtap kre samyachik oya teni rana sosu ngi zottap kendo sengi khirtap kendo samyaga tuchotreri nangla nyema rerevjin to Dawarere vision to semla nuh to zoko kres. Dani zon tengin derta uzopa chonchonchik shekman samya tipshina gansam shiglane gen chembo lepkyang no topke yo mara. Danda gen chonchonchik yongnayang natsu semla la halipa dunga chembo yongwe yore. Gardena rang derta uzu son rang semla. No tap semla no tap ma tap zayate sem korang kanor tangli. Tela rakli yo pare. Divshirna zopa gomyate hachang kachim bore rang samla nustup sheyate tamchab sheyate ni zawani ni de pshekman zeni yang to gomni chongchong ni zonten dampon zonten chimbu wato gomni sona gansamchila no to khyo mare ze khwena nga chu lupo yin kyang muscle exercise dan tiri shini lupo de la lustur jani top mena 노종이 되겠다고 아주 루보 옛날 루보 코랑라 루처리고 장 텐디시나 가서 харгут제 대한 이거 랩니 데니 릴하우시니 노크요 말 톱신 착로 데 남진 셈영 코랑 때 라나소수 셈더 노종 에베노 원어보 조모조테 노종 조모조 라나소수 삼노라 라글리오레 디프셔나 탐체근데 Samno Tangusa Halika Chembochi, Rev Samkandung, the mixer Chulukjigla Martin Nayama, Rana Sosu, Gimson Katoni, Samno Tani, Sonayang, Rupi Tribiopa, Nyamyong Tribiopa Chila, Tugore, Marere Genton, the Karchembo Peri Samkandu, Zetanza Tutsotala, Tani Karen Tawakarion.
So the first thing is that we need to kind of become aware of this, like how our mind operates, how it affects our experience. Thinking about it logically, reflecting on our own personal experience, just as I've been speaking about. And so the first step number one, then, is to recognize that as much as we dislike on things, as much as we hate on things or think I don't like or I'm not okay, is directly proportionate to how much we are going to suffer over things. So that's step one, acknowledging the role that our mind plays that is much greater actually than the actual conditions. And so then the second step, as soon as, we acknowledge that, is then to kind of reinforce and generate a strength of mind. We want to empower our mind. And so we go through a process where we actually want to think about this on a regular basis. how then the perception, like whenever we dislike something, we acknowledge this perception of dislike does not benefit me. Not only does it not benefit me, but as much as I dislike on this is going to be how much I suffer over it. It's going, and that dislike, the more that we justify why we're not okay with something, the more that our disturbing emotions grow around it. And so basically, we're just compounding our experience by justifying how right we are to not like it. And then we have more and more disturbing emotions. We have more and more suffering and unhappiness over it. And we're more likely to, engage in negative or, unfavorable actions due to that. And so we then recognize this is the flaw of disliking. And that's the first step. And then the second step is to generate to empower our mind, because the dislike disempowers our mind and causes us to become under the power of disturbing emotions. So then we want to empower our mind. So we acknowledge that disliking doesn't benefit us and it only creates more suffering. The second then is that we think, okay, I'm going to empower my mind, which is that to make a resolve, no matter what unfavorable condition occurs, I will be okay. I can bear it. Bear it meaning I don't have to be disturbed over it. I can tolerate it without being disturbed. I can be okay, essentially. And we want to build a habit of that, like on a daily basis, again and again. We recognize that the dislike is the source of it doesn't benefit us, causes affliction, and think then I can be okay. I'm going to build a capacity of mind, because the more easily disturbed we are, then the more vulnerable we are to harm. So basically, as much as we dislike things is going to be how much we suffer in life. And that just grows on itself and reinforces itself. So we want to change that habit and start to think, I can be okay. And we start with the tiny little things, the things that are insignificant, that irritate us, that we are unhappy about, that we just kind of dislike. We start there. And with that sense of, I'm okay. As soon as the dislike arises, we're like, I don't have to be disturbed over this. And then slowly what happens is, if we keep building this habit of recognizing that the flaw of disliking, and then the thought, I can be okay, I don't have to be disturbed, is it gradually our mind's capacity to be okay, to not be disturbed by things and not be harmed by things, grows. And so less and less disturbs us. And our capacity to be undisturbed, which is in this philosophy called patient forbearance, grows. And we keep making that intention. I vow to be okay. I vow not to be disturbed. And as our mind becomes more empowered and is less disturbed by the small things, then bigger and bigger things don't cause harm to it. And so we become less vulnerable to harm. There will be less things that upset us over time. And so it's really about building those small habits on a daily basis and just being really persistent with this. And then gradually our mental capacity grows, and we can think of it like exercise, like their physical body. If we exercise our physical body, then, for example, when we don't exercise, we have little tolerance to carry weight or to do certain things, and we can't do it. So our body is more vulnerable to harm, to becoming sore or injured. And then when we exercise by doing repetitive movements and trainings, then the muscles of our body grow and become conditioned and so forth. And then they're less vulnerable to harm, and they're stronger and able to carry more without hurting and so forth. And our mind is really exactly the same. That we want to exercise it. And the more that we strengthen our mind, the less that we're going to be harmed and upset by things. And so it begins when we really recognize that much of our experience is dependent on our mind. And that starts with a willingness to stop hating on things, to stop disliking things, and then to grow our kind of resolve to be more tolerant and less disturbed by things. And so this is something that I think is really important for everyone, especially in our current times. This is not specific to a religious belief. This is something that's based on logic and reasoning that accords with our basic reality, and everyone could be benefited by developing this.
Well, thank you. That I really appreciate you going through that and explaining that. I think it helps us to really understand where what would be a better place for us to come from, just not this judgment on things, like, dislike, stay in a path where we can get to a place of no judgment.
Yes, very good.
And you said something in your book that really stuck with me. And you talk about we operate under false assumptions, believing that things will stay the same each moment. And I can understand how true that could be. We think, oh, things are going so good or things are going so bad. It's always going to be that way.
Andy mi takpe kabla kerang ansu takpar tesa ansu tonang di netsu dong mitrumbare ansu takpar yen dabo takpar samlo tong kyori so yapo yena takpar yen go gre samgedu tang duksha chaptu ansu yang di mite gama di duksha re dabo chik samla shargedu ani dila tani dunga mampo doa tani mope samla mixel chik sharson
Re tate nga tsu kerang labia te dempare mu te trobare.
Re ketap nang mo chik.
Re. Teni tate kerang ke di hakoya namshin re tep ke nang la yopa namshin re shirtang ke nga tso maze di rewa gyapang te re. Nga tso rewa se chik tang tokpa se ni kup chang yo re. Sosu kewo se di semte re tok ni kup chang yo re. Rewa se te ha lepa ki teni nga tsu tu takto teni chigu dewa tang yekpu shuk ranyin chikpu nga la yekpo chik yung na nga chik yekpo chik shong song na samne teni rewa mampo gyapku yo re. Teyang teni ta takpa yinpa dawo chik tu takto te takpa yinpa chik la nga tsu samlo tanghe yo re. Te manjir na samya chik samlo tanghe yo re. 당전 첨보지 조크요. 가주 옛나요 역보지 송송나 때라 엄마 당전 첨보 할리바요 비겸산기 더니 무부 니룩라 강인경의 드리 그 딱바지 요 말에 옛나요 더니 코랑 인get로와 무부 추니데 코랑 말딱바로와 가래 인경 말딱바로 무부 추니데 대인get로비지라 엄미 당전 첨보 요 바데 냠송이 겸산기 영아주 설명라 동안마보 용비요래.
Rinpoche said, I'm not sure if you have a question there, but I could add a little bit to that, which is that we tend to live in this state of constant hope and fear, and our mind is bound by our hopes and fears, which really tie into our kind of belief that there's a permanent situation, whether it's good or bad. And so we are constantly perceiving things opposite to how they are. And then we're in this struggle because there is no permanent situation. There's nothing that's constant, whether it's good or bad. And so then, especially like we have good circumstances, and then we want to keep them like that. And we expect that for some reason, even though it has no bearing on reality, that when it's good, that it should stay that way. And so essentially, we're perceiving it as if it were literally permanent. When, because the nature of reality is such that it's impermanent, then it's inevitably going to change. And a big part of our suffering is because we want something to stay the same. And when it doesn't, and our expectations kind of fail us, then we're shocked and we suffer enormously over it. And so, when the good circumstances change and, maybe we have a loss of wealth or a loss of good health or work or whatever it might be in our life, basically when change happens, we often are kind of shocked. But if we had already perceived and related to that circumstance as being impermanent, then when it would happen, we wouldn't be shocked and we would have a lot less suffering over the fact that it did inevitably and eventually change. And so just kind of preparing ourselves for the reality of things by always relating to them with the mindset of there being impermanence is profoundly impactful on our lives. And again, just as we've been speaking about, that is all just a way of thinking.
In your book, you talk about impermanence, and I'd love for you to share the meaning. We'll kind of break it down for our listeners for us.
Tere, Deni Chiltang Murtak Bas at the Sanyin Chi Kariri Zenane Ta Nushik Mubo Yemba Kanjila, Nirvi Ramjan Chanchila, Murtak Bas, Zekiori, Horam. Murtak Bazati, Takbazati, Doshore, Takbazati, Justin Kirtani Marshipi, Chuchiona, Natsu. Takpari, Zekiori. Martakpazete, Koran, Rugby Martakpatan, Chai Martakpa, Niore, Rugby Martakpazete, Juntigoni Martakpa, Rakpa Juntigoni Martakpaze, Natsu Tandan, Jumabji Goni, not Chutamchelan, Yerama Bondohiopa, on Reargun Tong Shit, Mandawi Ramjin Jetokiopa, the Gilon Shuchik Saknayan, Hama Metokiopa. Merchik Kenayang, Hamahado Hiopa, La Sopi, when Nangato Capchigionang, Tampo Yonang, Jima Chakno Hiopate, Juntigoni Martapare. These Tawatiam Kawatu or is in an Tawa catching me Martapas, the Rumbabjin Toma, Tutsu Tono, Zoni Sonane, Sekurchik Topi Yolane, Kachima, Mampochik Zoiori. Tinanka. 하장가 두초 통후 뭐마 징아츠 셈그 직토야 그와가 두초 하장가 통후 때 같이 미마트바 세르데 뜻무부 추니 본접고 무부 추니 코랑 때레 드리시는 게바로 히오레스 마토모 나초 멋지긴 거 지나요 딱바르트 나랑 빼 마트비 나 일보당 드닝이 루포트 딱바리 삼니 좀좀좀디 대나오진트 루포 코랑야 딱바인라 Nyama Ninchigla Gingo Chakswanamji, yo mare. Garizina Kachi Revisionto, Jirni Rokio Pi Gimsanki, Kale Kaleshini Tracker, near my youth, Telasobat Hamche, Shongrokio Bade, or Tedishini Martapaze, Tedis. Di Martapi Mardupi Chu Kayang, Konzoko, Natsu, the Konzoku, Justin Katobli Shawak, Hamchelang, Di my Chapakaya, yo mares.
Did you share your Napantok?
Yeah, the pair for the Mubu Chuni Tong Tambachi Hako Yoni, Tinduhi, the Marta Pinduhi, the Yona, Pema to be Tela Tini, Semna to Samo Tong Tama Poching, Gervado Kyori, Matwa. Gangat New Drama Poching, Gervado Kyori, what did it is?
Yes, so impermanence, Rinpoche said, that is the nature of reality. And when we say impermanence, it means everything that is composite, which means everything that is a product of causes and conditions, is impermanent, meaning that its nature is of constant change. The opposite of impermanent is the concept of permanence, which would mean if something were permanent, it would mean it is not a product of causes and conditions, and therefore is forever the same. And there is nothing in our world that is permanent. And so when we look at impermanence, it's beginning to develop a kind of a healthy relationship of perceiving the way things are. And there are two kinds of impermanence. There's perceptible impermanence and imperceptible impermanence. Perceptible impermanence is everything that we see that changes. And so any change that becomes perceptible to us, we can see like changes in our environment, in the elements of the earth and constituents of the earth and everything around us, the changing of the seasons, the fact that wealth is either accumulated or lost, that everything that is born, everyone who is born will end up dying, that every object that we encounter, even just our kitchen cups, then what it was produced and it will end at some point or other. It has an inevitable end. And so then all of the perceptible forms of change that we see then are what we call perceptible impermanence. And those are only possible because of the imperceptible, subtle, continuous impermanence that is always the case, down to the smallest, subtlemost moments of time. Even when we snap a finger, Rinpoche said, in fact, that could be divided into many subtler moments of time. And each of those is a moment of change. And so the relative reality of our experience is that everything's nature is changing. Which means, for example, when we get old, that didn't just happen at a certain kind of period on the time scale of our lives, but actually every single second of our life, our body is changing. Aging is taking place. It wasn't like we were youthful and then suddenly we were old, but each moment of our life was a process of changing that led to, white hair and wrinkles and all those things that many of us have aversion to. But it didn't just happen in a moment. It happened from the moment we were born. Aging was taking place. And so this is kind of like the reality of everything, is that there is no phenomena in our relative experience that is not impermanent. And that means that everything is permeated by a continuous change that is not only changes that are obvious, but the obvious changes are due to the continuous, subtlemost momentary change that is always taking place. The purpose and value of starting to relate to everything in terms of impermanence is that impermanence is the way things are. It's the reality. And so then we tend to suffer over things because we struggle against that when we think of it as being permanent or it should be lasting and so forth. And so as we relate more and more to things according to the way they are, such as being impermanent, then that perception then is corresponds to how things are. And so then our mind is more realistic about the way things are. It changes our whole mind's way of thinking in relation to them. And when our way of thinking changes, then that decreases the amount of disturbing emotions and negative thoughts we have and increases our sort of acceptance of the way things are and our ability to relate to and to cope with them as they are. And so it's another contemplation that is highly effective in training our mind in terms of decreasing our negative thoughts and emotions and increasing our positive qualities.
What final thoughts would Rinpoche like to leave with our listeners today?
Yeah, teni ngi tamade kare yinse na ngindi tepti mala semchi nustup zeate te labiore. Teni ngatsu jugma teni kare lapi yinse na di lobjung kanang na tap ma boyore. Di tap de chola tenna na ngipert teni sem khorang la dungarli tarbi nuhche nurtop tang teni sem khorang la dewa jibden tartukpachi tuptupi nurtupte sem khorang la yores. Tipshena sem dungarli rawang topatang, sem dungarli trortapa, sem dungarli tartapa te ngipert ngubu chuni la lwa me pandawachi chakyore. Ngatsu sem te gimber rawang me pa jangwang de kiriore. Gimsen kare zena yurgu shurur yurgu zugda tero raksha lasok patang na teni zonte ngatang ni jipanam jimke hamchela chakpatang devjin to control tang taktok tang argil lasok pa jangwang chang lan roni dungarchi li taktok yo mara.
That's right.
Kani semla nga lunchi tamango mating dengti karizena ne rawa tamchi dewayin jalwa tamchi dungarin zete kyutsok lam sonna yang testawre tayinang semlam sonna yang techik pa chakhayore semla rawa top zachi yore tazena karizena ne sem khorang stinki wanto rumor kuma sem ko yur wang girwa mahtok kuma yur ki semde wang gir murgu bachik. Then tadi namjin ke semde la rang wang top roa chi niperti ore nga su semna. Gimsen kangre na sem khorang ka ramjin ye ni chu kang na ramjin zya yorwa. Ti ramjin te ye ni khorang nde imbares. Teni 좀 탐첼리 따리용간 당원인이 겨 득비람진 잔다 머게 위람진 마임바 호랑 그 집대 임바당 윤던 그 사운만 보지 자종 그 출기 용칸지 그래서 개와만 보 어떠니 다 같이 되니 장난되게 넣으시 그때 마스입니다.
Okay. So thank you, Rinpoche said. I just want to, I guess, in these final moments, just say that when we look at the title of this book, The Power of Mind, which is full of methods for working with our mind that we call mind training, then the basis of this is that the power of our mind is such that we actually have the power in our own mind to overcome and find freedom from all of our suffering and our mental afflictions. And we have the power in our own mind to find a true peace and happiness within ourselves. And it really is up to our mind and the power of our mind that we access the potential within ourselves for doing this. And so the reason why we suffer over things is because then our mind is under the influence, under the power of other circumstances. And when our mind gains its own power, is no longer dependent upon the conditions, it has the power to find freedom from those circumstances. And so for as long as we're completely dependent and under the power of other circumstances, forms, sounds, tastes, sense, tactile sensations, and stuck in that perception about how our experience is controlled by the circumstances and the thoughts of I and my and all of our grasping and attachment to those circumstances and our fears and our worries and anxieties and disturbing emotions and so forth, all of that is because our mind is under the power of the circumstances, is controlled by or under the power of other circumstances. Like if we think of a cell phone, for example, how much then we put it next to us all the time, and then we're constantly going to it. And so basically we're being controlled by we're allowing our mind to be controlled by our cell phones, just as an example. But essentially then, we cannot find freedom from suffering for as long as our experience and our mind's experience is dependent upon the external circumstances. We'll always be afflicted. And so I have one final quote that I'd like to leave you and everyone with, which is this: having power over our own mind is happiness. Being controlled by or being under the power of other is suffering. And so beginning to recognize this, that for as long as we're dependent on other circumstances, then for our mental well-being and so forth, then we will always have a struggle. But our mental well-being isn't dependent upon those conditions. If we gain power over our mind through working with our mind, then our mind's happiness and well-being is not subject to the circumstances. And we can no longer be harmed by those conditions. And this is because our mind's actual nature is not a state of affliction. Our mind's actual nature is not inherently flawed. It's not negative. It isn't all of this suffering and pain. Our mind's actual innate and pure nature is a state of peacefulness and of well-being and contains all the potentials for all positive qualities. And these are inherent to us because it's our mind's own nature. And that is what we want to uncover or reveal within ourselves. And that's when we discover the power of our own mind. And so that's what I'd like to share with everyone today. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show with us here today.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Rinpoche. It has been such an honor to spend this time with you and to talk about your new book, The Power of the Mind. The Power of the Mind's available at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and all indie retailers. And remember, support our indie bookstores. If you'd like to learn more about his work and be part of his community, visit his website, katog.org. We're going to pause here for a quick moment, and we'll be right back after this message. I'd like to thank Jason Eastwood at Guitarfulness for sharing his inspiring music and talent with us. His music is known worldwide for cultivating atmospheres of harmony, inner peace, and clarity. Visit Jason's website at guitarfulness.com. Join his newsletter, be part of his community, and download his music. Well, we're at the end of our time today. I'd like to thank everyone for tuning in. You've been listening to Moments with Marianne, where we make every moment count.
In a single moment, your life can change. Moments with Marianne is a transformative hour that covers an endless array of topics with the best of the best. Her guests are leaders in their fields, ranging from inspirational authors, top industry leaders, and business and spiritual entrepreneurs. Each guest is gifted and a true visionary, a recognized leader in her own work, and while teaching others to develop, refocus, and grow, Marianne will bring the best guest and sometimes a special surprise. Don't miss this. You never know just which moment will change your life forever. Make sure to tune in and visit momentswithmarianne.com for more information.